The billionaire's unexpected gesture. It was a frosty December morning when Emily Carter, a middle school teacher in Chicago, walked into her classroom and noticed something heartbreaking. Several of her students, most from low-income families, were shivering in old, worn-out shoes with holes in them. Some had duct tape holding the soles together, while others wore sneakers so thin they might as well have been barefoot in the snow. Emily had seen poverty before, but this winter felt harsher than ever. It was a season of joy for some, yet for many of her students, the holidays only meant colder nights and empty stomachs. That evening, as she sat in her tiny apartment grading papers, she decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. She took out her savings, a modest amount she had set aside for emergencies, and bought warm, sturdy shoes for her neediest students. She didn't tell anyone. She just slipped the shoes into their cubbies the next morning and watched as their eyes lit up in surprise and gratitude. What Emily didn't know was that one small act of kindness was about to set off a chain of events that would change her life forever. A viral story. One of Emily's students, a bright but quiet boy named Jordan, went home that day and excitedly told his mother what had happened. His mother, deeply moved, shared the story on Facebook, simply writing, "My son's teacher used her own money to buy shoes for kids who needed them. Angels walk among us." Within hours, the post was shared hundreds of times. By the next morning, it had gone viral. Local news stations picked up the story, then national media. People were praising Emily for her selflessness, calling her a hero. That's when billionaire tech mogul Alexander Grayson saw the story. A call from the unreachable. Grayson, one of the richest men in America, was known for his ruthless business acumen. He had built an empire in Silicon Valley and was worth billions, but he rarely engaged in charity, at least, not in a way that made headlines. But something about Emily's story struck a nerve. He had grown up poor, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. He knew what it felt like to have worn-out shoes in the winter. He knew the shame, the discomfort, the silent longing to be like other kids. Without hesitation, he picked up the phone and made a call. The invitation. Emily was in the middle of a history lesson when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She ignored it. When it rang again during lunch, she finally answered. "Miss Carter?" a professional voice asked. "Yes?" "Please hold for Mr. Alexander Grayson." Emily nearly dropped her sandwich. A moment later, a deep, authoritative voice came through the line. "Miss Carter, this is Alexander Grayson. I saw what you did for your students. I'd like to meet you." Emily, still in shock, could barely form a reply. Meet me? Why?" "Because people like you change the world. And I want to help." An offer she couldn't believe. A few days later, Emily found herself in a sleek, glass-walled office in San Francisco. Grayson was as intimidating in person as he was in photos, tall, sharply dressed, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to read her every thought. After exchanging pleasantries, he got straight to the point. "I want to fund your school," he said. "Not just shoes, everything. New facilities, better salaries for teachers, technology, after-school programs, scholarships. Name it, and it's yours." Emily was stunned. I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," Grayson replied with a rare smile. Tears welled in her eyes. She had spent years watching brilliant students struggle simply because they were born into poverty. And now, in an instant, everything was about to change. A billionaire's unexpected gesture. Grayson didn't just donate, he got involved. He visited the school, met the students, and even sat in on one of Emily's classes. He set up a $50 million foundation to ensure that no child in her school, or any other struggling school in the city, would ever go without the basics again. Reporters asked him why he had done it. His answer was simple. Because once upon a time, I was one of those kids. Emily's single act of kindness had sparked something she never could have imagined. She had changed lives, and in the process, she had inspired a man who had everything to remember what truly mattered. And that winter, for the first time, every single one of her students walked through the snow with warm feet and even warmer hearts. A ripple effect. The transformation at Westwood Middle School was nothing short of a miracle. Within months, the rundown classrooms were renovated with state-of-the-art equipment, every student received free meals, and extracurricular programs flourished. Scholarships poured in, giving kids from struggling families a real shot at a better future. But what Emily hadn't expected was how the story would continue to spread. Schools across the country began reaching out, inspired by what had happened in Chicago. Other wealthy philanthropists, moved by Grayson's example, started similar initiatives in their own cities. One night, as Emily sat in her now buzzing inbox, reading an email from a teacher in Detroit thanking her for starting something bigger than herself, she realized that her simple decision, to buy a few pairs of shoes, had grown into something beyond her wildest dreams. And then, the unexpected happened again. An invitation to the world stage. It was late one evening when Emily received another phone call from an unknown number. This time, she answered without hesitation. "Miss Carter, this is the office of the President of the United States. The President would like to invite you to the White House." Emily's heart nearly stopped. The invitation was for a special ceremony honoring educators who had made a national impact. And at the top of the list was her name. She flew to Washington, D.C., where she found herself standing in the East Room of the White House, surrounded by political leaders, educators, and business moguls. Grayson was there, watching proudly from the crowd. When she stepped up to the podium, she took a deep breath, scanning the faces of the people before her. The weight of what had happened over the past year pressed against her chest. "I never set out to change the world," she began, her voice steady. "I just wanted my students to have warm feet in the winter. But I've learned something incredible: kindness doesn't stop where you expect it to. It ripples. It grows. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it changes everything." The room erupted into applause. A new mission. After the White House event, offers flooded in. Universities wanted her to speak. Philanthropic organizations wanted her to consult. Even publishing houses were interested in turning her story into a book. But Emily knew her heart belonged in the classroom. She made a choice: she would continue teaching but also work with Grayson to expand his foundation. They launched the Future First Initiative, a nationwide program dedicated to helping underfunded schools. One evening, after a long day of teaching, she found herself on the phone with Grayson, discussing the next steps for their project. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I never expected to get involved in something like this." "And I never expected to get a phone call from a billionaire," she laughed. There was a pause. Then, more seriously, he said, "But I think this is the most important thing I've ever done." She smiled, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "Me too." The legacy of a gesture. Years later, people still talked about Emily Carter, the teacher who started a movement with a simple act of kindness. And in cities across the country, thousands of children walked into classrooms that were warm, welcoming, and filled with opportunity, all because one teacher bought a few pairs of shoes, and one billionaire decided to listen to his heart. And so, the ripple continued. A global awakening. As the Future First initiative expanded, its impact stretched far beyond the United States. Stories of underprivileged children receiving proper education, meals, and resources began emerging from places Emily had never imagined. Schools in Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia reached out, eager to adopt similar programs. One day, as Emily sat in her office, now inside the headquarters of the initiative, her assistant knocked on the door. "You might want to see this," she said, placing a letter on Emily's desk. It was from a small village in India. "Miss Carter, because of you, my little sister now goes to school with shoes on her feet. She no longer cries from the cold. Thank you for believing that children like us deserve a chance." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. The ripple effect she had once spoken about was no longer just a dream, it was a reality. An unexpected proposition. One evening, Emily and Alexander Grayson met at a quiet cafe in New York City, away from the cameras and flashing lights that now followed them everywhere. "You look exhausted," Grayson noted as she stirred her tea absent-mindedly. Emily sighed. "I am. But it's the best kind of exhaustion." Grayson leaned forward. "I've been thinking about something, Emily. The foundation is growing faster than either of us expected. Schools around the world need this help. What if we did more?" Emily raised an eyebrow. "More? I mean, what if we built schools? Not just funded them, but actually created institutions from the ground up? Places where no child is turned away, no matter where they come from." Emily's breath caught. The idea was massive. It was risky. It was overwhelming. But it was also right. "You're serious?" she asked. Grayson smirked. "I don't do things halfway, Miss Carter." A slow smile spread across her face. "Neither do I." And just like that, the Carter Grayson Academy was born. The academy that changed the world. Over the next 5 years, the Carter Grayson Academy became a beacon of hope. The first campus opened in Chicago, providing free, top-tier education to children from low-income families. Then another opened in Detroit. Then one in rural Texas. Then India. Then Brazil. By the 10th year, there were 50 academies across the world. Each one carried the same mission: no child left behind. Ever. Emily was no longer just a teacher. She was a world changer. An interview to remember. Years later, Emily found herself sitting in an interview with one of the most famous journalists in the world. The cameras were rolling, and the audience waited for her answer to one important question. "Miss Carter, did you ever think that buying those shoes would lead to all of this?" She smiled, thinking of the kids who no longer walked barefoot, the students who now had bright futures, and the billionaire who had once been just another name in the headlines but had become her greatest ally. "No," she admitted, her voice soft. "I never thought it would. But that's the thing about kindness, you never know just how far it will go." The crowd erupted into applause. And somewhere in the world, in a tiny classroom, another teacher saw Emily's story and decided to do something small but meaningful for her students. And so, the ripple continued. The true measure of wealth. Alexander Grayson, once known as the ruthless tech billionaire, was now something else entirely. When people spoke of him, they no longer talked about his billions. They talked about his legacy, about the schools he built, about the kids he helped. At an event celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Carter Grayson Academy, a journalist asked him, "Mr. Grayson, you've made and given away more money than most people could ever dream of. What do you consider your greatest investment?" Grayson didn't hesitate. He turned to Emily, then to the hundreds of children in the audience, children who had once been forgotten but now had a future. "This," he said. "Every single one of them. And as he looked out at the sea of young, hopeful faces, he knew, deep down, that this was the best deal he had ever made. A new challenge. The Carter Grayson Academy had transformed thousands of lives, but success came with new challenges. As the academies expanded worldwide, critics emerged. Some accused them of creating elite schools for the poor, while others claimed they were overstepping government education programs. One evening, Emily and Alexander sat in his Manhattan office, reviewing news reports. "Are the Carter Grayson Academies too good to be true?" one headline read. Emily sighed, tossing the article aside. "We're literally giving kids an education they wouldn't have otherwise." "How is that a bad thing?" Grayson smirked. "When you change the status quo, people get uncomfortable. But we didn't come this far to stop now." She nodded. "So, what's next?" He leaned back, eyes gleaming. "We go bigger. A revolution in education." Determined to break barriers, Emily and Grayson launched their most ambitious project yet, the Future First Global Network. Instead of just building schools, they created an open-source digital education system available for free to any school, teacher, or student in the world. The platform provided top-tier lesson plans, AI-driven tutoring, and virtual classrooms accessible via low-cost tablets, even in remote areas. Within a year, over 5 million students were using the system. Governments took notice. Some embraced it. Others resisted. But no one could ignore it. Then came the call that changed everything. A meeting with the United Nations. Emily and Grayson were invited to address the United Nations General Assembly. Their mission had grown beyond a charity. This was about reshaping the future of global education. As Emily stood at the podium, looking out at world leaders, she took a deep breath. "We live in a world where talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. That needs to change." She spoke about the power of knowledge, the need for equal education, and the future they were building. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Afterward, a leader from an African nation approached her. "If we partner with you, can we bring this to every child in my country?" Emily smiled. "That's the goal." The unexpected turn. As the initiative grew, so did Emily and Grayson's partnership. They had spent years building schools, fighting bureaucracy, and standing side by side in moments of triumph and challenge. One evening, after another exhausting yet fulfilling day, they found themselves alone in Grayson's private jet, flying back from a conference. Emily glanced at him. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" He chuckled. "No. I thought I'd be making the next billion-dollar company, not changing the world with a teacher." She smirked. "And I thought I'd still be grading essays in a cramped classroom." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then, Grayson spoke quietly. "I think this is the most important thing I've ever done." Emily met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "Me too." The legacy lives on. Decades later, the Future First initiative had reached over 100 million students worldwide. The Carter Grayson schools stood in every continent. And the free education system had become the largest digital learning network in history. One day, as an elderly Emily sat on the porch of her home, she received a letter. "Miss Carter, I was one of the kids who received a pair of shoes from you all those years ago. Today, I am a teacher. And I bought shoes for my students, just like you did for me. Thank you for showing me what kindness can do." Tears filled her eyes. Because in the end, it had never been about wealth, power, or recognition. It had always been about a single act of kindness and the unstoppable ripple it created. The next generation. Years had passed, and Emily Carter, now widely regarded as the woman who revolutionized global education, had finally retired from the day-to-day operations of the Future First initiative. But the legacy she and Alexander Grayson had built was far from over. The academies continued to grow. The digital education system had reached over 200 million students. Governments had adopted their open-source curriculum, leveling the playing field for children who once had no access to proper education. But as Emily sat in her quiet countryside home, sipping tea on her porch, she knew one thing for certain: the world still had work to do. Then, one afternoon, she received a phone call. "Miss Carter," a young voice said. "My name is Liam Grayson. I believe you knew my father." Emily's breath caught. The son of a billionaire. Liam Grayson, Alexander's only son, had just turned 28. Unlike his father, who had built a tech empire before shifting to philanthropy, Liam had grown up watching the world change under the Carter-Grayson academies. And now, he wanted to take it even further. "I don't want to be just another billionaire's kid," he told Emily over lunch in New York. "I want to do something real. Something that matters." Emily studied him, seeing the same fire in his eyes that she had once seen in his father's. "What's your vision?" she asked. Liam leaned forward. "The world has changed, but education is still stuck in the past. I want to bring AI-driven, personalized learning to every child, everywhere. No more standardized tests. No more outdated curriculums. Imagine if every student had an AI tutor that adapted to their strengths and weaknesses, learning at their own pace, in their own way." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Sounds ambitious." He grinned. "So was everything you and my dad did." She couldn't argue with that. A new era, the Carter-Grayson Institute. With Emily's guidance, Liam launched the Carter-Grayson Institute for Future Learning, a think tank dedicated to the next stage of education. Instead of just building schools, they started designing immersive virtual classrooms, places where students from any country could experience hands-on learning through augmented reality. They partnered with space agencies to teach kids about the universe through real-time simulations. They worked with medical professionals to bring holographic anatomy lessons to students who had never even seen a real laboratory. And with AI-driven personal tutors, even children in the most remote villages could now receive an education tailored just for them. The world was changing once again. Emily's final lesson. One day, as Emily walked through the halls of the newest Carter-Grayson Academy in Nairobi, she found herself in a classroom full of bright-eyed students. A young girl raised her hand. "Miss Carter, is it true that you started all of this with just a pair of shoes?" Emily smiled, kneeling beside her. "It's true. But do you know what the real lesson is?" The girl shook her head. "The smallest act of kindness," Emily said softly, "can change the world in ways you can't even imagine." The girl thought for a moment, then nodded, determination shining in her eyes. "Then I'm going to help people too." Emily squeezed her hand. And that's how the ripple continues. A legacy that never ends. As Emily Carter looked back on her life, she knew that the journey she had started was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every teacher who believed in their students. It belonged to every child who was given a chance. It belonged to every person who chose kindness when they didn't have to. And somewhere, in a tiny classroom, another teacher saw her story and decided to do something small but meaningful for their students. And so, the ripple continued. The final chapter, a life well lived. Years passed, and the world Emily Carter had helped build flourished. The Carter-Grayson Institute for Future Learning had reshaped education globally. Schools, both physical and virtual, were thriving. Children from all backgrounds, rich, poor, rural, urban, now had equal access to knowledge. Emily, now in her late 80s, had long stepped back from the public eye. She spent her days in a quiet countryside home, surrounded by books, letters from former students, and memories of a life dedicated to others. One crisp autumn afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. A young woman, no older than 25, stood at her doorstep, holding a notebook against her chest. She had dark, intelligent eyes and an air of quiet confidence. "Miss Carter?" she asked. Emily smiled. "Yes, dear. Come in." The woman sat across from her in the cozy living room, clearly nervous but determined. "My name is Alina," she said. "I grew up in a refugee camp. My family lost everything. I never thought I'd have a future. But then, I found the Future First digital platform. It changed my life. I studied every night, sometimes under a street lamp. And because of that, I earned a scholarship to a Carter Grayson Academy. Now, I'm a teacher." Emily's eyes filled with warmth. "That's wonderful, Alina. I'm so proud of you." Alina hesitated before continuing. "I came here because I want to ask you something. I'm writing a book about education, about the power of kindness. And I wanted to know, if you could go back to that moment, the moment you decided to buy those shoes, would you do it all over again?" Emily chuckled softly, reaching for a framed photo on the table beside her. It was an old picture of her and Alexander Grayson, standing in front of the very first Carter Grayson Academy. They both looked younger, hopeful, and full of purpose. She turned back to Alina, her voice filled with certainty. "I wouldn't change a single thing," she said. "Because one small act of kindness can create a future we never dared to dream." Alina smiled, understanding the weight of those words. Emily took a deep breath, looking out at the golden leaves falling outside her window. She had done what she came into this world to do. She had changed lives, and in turn, those lives would go on to change others. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she closed her eyes, at peace, knowing that the ripple she started would never truly end.